Well, let's talk about that Supreme Court decision and more with our journalist panel. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance is Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. And Bob Fife is Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Tonda, I want to start with you. We have this ruling on the Safe Third Country Agreement today. What's the significance?
Well, look, I guess what it does is it upholds the government's view that a deal with the U.S. on how to treat the flow of refugee seekers across the borders is a valid one, is a constitutional one. The court basically found that there are enough legal safeguards there that the rights of people seeking refugee status, if they're turned back at the Canadian border back into the U.S., that they have enough protections there that this law is constitutionally valid. And the refugee advocates still maintain that the U.S. is not a safe country for refugee seekers, but Sean Fraser, the immigration minister, said today they're going with the validity of it and they're not dropping it. They're not going to suspend it or withdraw from it.
Okay, Bob, let me turn to another minister, the Minister of Public Safety, and his handling of Paul Bernardo's transfer. We've had 3 straight days now of Conservative demands for Marco Mendicino to resign. What do you think the future holds for Mr. Mendicino now?
Well, look, we're all expecting a cabinet shuffle in the coming weeks after the House shuts down and before the Prime Minister goes on holidays. I would think it would be very unlikely that Mr. Mendicino would remain in a very important portfolio as public safety. He's really screwed this one up badly. And this falls a couple months ago when he tried to play politics with the gun control legislation and introduced a ban on hunting guns that were used by rural hunters and rural people and indigenous people, and blew up in their face. They had to withdraw the legislation. And now he's completely mishandled the whole issue of Paul Bernardo, saying he didn't know, blaming his staff. Nobody gets fired. It turns out the Prime Minister office all knew. Nobody apparently told the Prime Minister. So I can't see him remaining in that portfolio. I think he'll end up getting demoted. Whether he gets dumped from the cabinet, I don't know. But it has not been a very good 6 months for Marco Mendicino, and this week has been really bad for him.
Okay, and Joël-Denis, this week, we did hear Marco Mendicino say he's going to force officials to notify the minister about high-profile transfers, that he's dealt with the matter with his staff internally, that the transfer of Paul Bernardo, of course, is under review. But to Bob's point, we're dealing with one of this country's most notorious criminals. Yes. Do you think any of this is going to be enough?
No, and the oppositions, I think, will keep demanding that Mr. Mendicino be shuffled out of his position or shuffled out of cabinet. I've talked to some cabinet ministers already, and they're speculating that they expect a cabinet shuffle in July. And some ministers speculated that who could take over Mr. Mendicino's portfolio? Mark Holland, who was parliamentary secretary to public security minister, and he's been doing well as a House leader in the House of Commons.
Dominic LeBlanc.
Dominic LeBlanc.
Dominic LeBlanc's name is floated too.
Also, so
both those names I've heard.
Yeah, so it's interesting that cabinet ministers are already speculating about the future of the cabinet, whereas Mr. Trudeau, I think, is still contemplating a cabinet shuffle. But to me, I think when Mr. Trudeau does shuffle his cabinet, he's got to read the riot act to his cabinet ministers, because there have been a lot of missteps from not only Mr. Mendicino, but Bill Blair, Harjit Sajjan, and so...
Somebody needs to read it to the Prime Minister too, though.
And Tonda, so just to go back to Marco Mendicino, reporters did corner him Thursday for a few minutes, but we still don't have a real clear view of how the communication was handled within his staff on the Bernardo matter. And we've just heard talk about Harjit Sajjan, about Bill Blair. We've heard testimony this week about CSIS intelligence on foreign interference, how that's being handled in the government. And we even have Liberals this week saying, yes, there are some problems here with how the government is handling information. What does this all add up to?
Well, it's not really clear that there's one storyline here. I mean, in some cases, there are systemic problems with how CSIS communicated with political masters, and that's agency. But what baffles me is how political staff, even if they thought that there was nothing Mr. Mendicino could have done to change the course of Bernardo's transfer because it's an independent decision, they must have recognized the political ramifications for any government facing that question. And so why he wasn't given a heads up, none of that makes sense. It speaks to a bit of political complacency maybe at this stage in the mandate of the government, or maybe there's just been so much turnover in staff that their antenna isn't, triggered to this kind of thing. But there are many problems, I would say.
Or it's, I don't want to know. If there's something really bad, don't tell us. Because, this track record is getting to be very bad.
Yeah.
Yep. And if staff are under the unwritten rule is, if this is controversial, let's not tell the Prime Minister and let's not tell the Minister. And then they can come out and say, well, we didn't know, it's my staff.
So whether it's, I guess, a laissez-faire attitude to information or it's a willful political blindness, either one bodes badly for the government, right? The government and the people in the key positions of power need to be aware of these things. And clearly there's something going wrong. I mean, on no planet was the decision to transfer Paul Bernardo something that should have just been left to a bureaucrat to just, that's just some bureaucratic decision and we don't need to think or contemplate. What were the rights of victims? How does the privacy of Paul Bernardo trump the right of the families to know about it?
Joël-Denis, weigh on here how the information is flowing.
Yeah, well, that would be the kind of mistakes that you could see in the early stages of a government. Not a government that has been in power for 8 years. It's amateur hour at its best. And there needs to be some kind of a shake-up from the top to the bottom to make sure that this government does not become dysfunctional, because that's sort of what we're seeing. Ministers not knowing key information about their department. That's not how government works.
Well, I want to quickly turn to the foreign interference story and how that's developed, Joël-Denis, because 1 week ago we had David Johnston resigning, saying the partisan atmosphere had made it impossible for him to continue. Now in the days since, we've seen some cross-partisan talks on a potential public inquiry. We've had the government saying we need opposition feedback on this. What do you make of how this story has been evolving?
Well, we're back to square one, I guess. In March, Mr. Trudeau thought he could, dodge the issue or dodge that bullet by appointing a rapporteur, which was a new word for a lot of people, rapporteur. Now he's back to square one, and I think the fact that he's reaching out to opposition parties is just showing that he knows his corner on that issue, and the only way out, to me, is to launch a public consultation with the support of the opposition parties, contributing to maybe to suggestion as to who could lead that public inquiry. So I guess the issue is so important, it's the future of democracy, that it needs to be a transpartisan, if I may say, cross-partisan dealt with.
Yeah, Tonda, how do you see this onus now that the government is putting on the opposition here?
Well, I'm not sure that no matter what names are put forward, that all parties will necessarily agree. The Bloc Québécois put forward a number of names this week, including Louise Arbour, and I already heard people say, well, her daughter ran for the NDP, and including Erwin Collar, who, by the way, was a former Liberal cabinet minister. So, look, I think the opposition parties are going to always reserve their right to criticize, and I don't think that they're going to let the Trudeau government or the Prime Minister himself off the hook for making a tough decision. He needs to make a decision. It will be his, and at the end of the day, and they will reserve the right to criticize it. But it's a clever maneuver on the government's part to try and get the opposition to take some responsibility for it. But really, it is a government decision on how to deal with this. And actually, I think we've said this before on this panel, there are actions they could have taken and should take more quickly. Establish a foreign interference or a foreign influence registry, make foreign interference in elections a criminal offense. Why is that not already the case? So, look, there are actions that the government should and could take responsibility for immediately.
And Bob, we certainly heard diaspora groups, for instance, say that they want more action. You could be doing some of the things we've recommended. For a public inquiry is going to take a very long time to come to conclusions.
A public inquiry is really important, because we have to find out why did the government know about these interference in 2019 and 2021? Was it ignored because it may have benefited the Liberals or not? That has not really been answered by Mr. Johnson, because he simply accepted the word of the Liberals. And we need a public inquiry. If the terms of references are done properly by the opposition parties, we'll be able to say, okay, you're hopefully would be a judge, or you can compel evidence, you can get subpoena powers, you can actually find out what has gone on. In fact, whether there was a lot of inaction in other agencies as well. But we need to find this out, and at the same time, we need to come up with other solutions than just what Tonda is talking about, long-term solutions. And I think the NDP make a very good point. This activity is not unique to China, even though they're the number one country of concern. It's happening in the South Asian community in this country. And I think Mr. Singh spoke eloquently about how, as a Sikh Canadian, how many in his community have felt that the Indian government has been interfering in the democratic process in this country. So it's not, because we're a pluralistic, multicultural society, you do have some of this stuff involved in our election process, whether it's at the municipal level or the provincial level or the federal level, and we need to have laws in place or safeguards in place to protect Canadians so they can vote freely.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Bob, Tonda, and Joël-Denis, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.